operates the world. Over my dead body, over my dead body, over my dead body, over mine. They have all the money, we have the will, and I would rather be a match than a paper dollar bill. Yes, I would any day. Yes, I would. They have the guns, all we are is flesh and blood, but we will multiply our numbers.
There are a lot of y'all here. You don't see that from facing the other direction. I'm honored to be sharing a podium with so many wise, articulate, caring people. And I'm especially glad to see so many of you who I don't know who have made the time to come out tonight, so thank you for that. My name is Erin Wunker. I teach in the Department of English here at Dalhousie, and I direct the Canadian Studies program. And I'm pretty thrilled to see so many people that I think are students in the audience. Okay, like Taylor, I have been set with the task of discussing and addressing the history and effects of colonialism in Canada. And though Taylor and I tried really hard to get together, we didn't. But I think actually we probably did connect somehow, because what I have to say to you buttresses nicely, I think, to what she said. I'm going to speak to you from my position as a professor of literature, right? Meaning that I'm going to talk to you about a couple of terms. I'm going to talk about three things: settler colonialism, narrative representation, and unlearning. And Taylor has already started us on the process of unlearning. Additionally, I'm going to suggest to you some of the ways that I see Idle No More modeling and creating collaborative and coalitional space for acknowledging the damaging effects of colonialism, as well as moving forward in productive and generative ways. But I can only start to speak to you about the colonial history and its lasting effects by first acknowledging my own position. I am non-Aboriginal. I have settler colonial ancestry, meaning that I benefited from colonialism long before I understood what that word meant. I'm also speaking to you as someone who's trained as a literary and cultural studies scholar who conducts her teaching and research in the fields of Canadian literary and cultural production, meaning I think about the way that stories circulate. I think about the work that stories do, the way that they can move from stories, subjective accounts, into history, seemingly inscrutable facts, or in the opposite direction, the way that they can move from facts into stories. You've all been given a handout prepared by the good people of Solidarity Halifax that Taylor started to walk us through already. It's a clear and, as they note on the top of it, partial chronology of some of the historical colonial events in this region specifically, beginning with the arrival of Europeans, or what we might refer to more accurately as first contact between the people who lived here and the people who came to live here. What I want to do with the time that I have is not to work through those dates, to acknowledge them, right? But more so to think about the ways that historical events have been narrativized, put into story, and the way that those stories have moved into dominant understandings of Canada's colonial history. So to do that, I'm going to move to those three terms that I mentioned to you. First, I think it's probably useful to understand what settler colonialism means. You may have seen it as a meme on the internet. I'm going to break it down into an actual definition. When I use the term settler colonialism, I'm referring to the particular kind of colonial history that a country like Canada has. At its most basic, colonialism can be defined as a practice of domination, which involves the subjugation of one people to another. There are many different kinds of ways that colonialism is enacted, and Canada was forged predominantly through settler colonialism. Settler colonialism occurs when colonial powers relocate settlers from the home country, France and Britain predominantly, into the colonized lands. These settlers leave their homes permanently, and they tend to act as occupiers. They develop a sense of difference from their home country, sometimes forgetting or losing their awareness of their settler status. I don't always and didn't initially identify or understand that my history was settler colonial, in other words. Indeed, this forgetting or loss of awareness over time is part of the role that narrative plays. Rather than remembering and teaching Canadians about colonial history, narrative gets inverted. distorted, and often the narrative becomes simply and egregiously wrong. A small example. 2009, Prime Minister Stephen Harper told an international audience of G20 members that Canada, and I quote, has no history of colonialism. The second concept I want to introduce is a way of thinking about how settler colonial history has shaped narratives and relationships fundamentally between First Nations peoples and Canadian relationships is the concept of narrative representation, or how stories work. Narrative means story. It's the aestheticized version of an account or events. Narrative representation, and in settler colonial nations, narrative representation in settler colonial nations can represent or function as a tool to facilitate this historical forgetting. Like historical events and statements such as the Prime Minister's disavowal of Canada's colonial history, these circulate as damaging and pernicious narratives. They augment other long-standing narrative representations of Canada, Canadians, First Nations. A couple of examples, right? We see them show up in seemingly innocuous places like beer ads. As my students will groan and know, because I've stated this I think maybe twice in the last 24 hours, narratives of Canada as a vast and empty wilderness do more than convey images of awe-inspiring nature. They also subtly reinforce founding narratives of this land as unpopulated prior to the arrival of Europeans. And this, in turn, serves to justify settler colonial occupation and aggressive assimilation policies that emerge as the Canadian government's official stance towards people, First Nations people. And here's the thing about stereotypes, right? If you're not the one being misrepresented by them, then they don't require you to think or work to understand their history or context or your complicity with them. They translate into simplistic, incorrect, sensationalistic, or misleading narratives. So narrative has long played a role in the formation of Canadian national consciousness, and it's done so in a settler colonial fashion through the willful forgetting of colonial history. Narrative has the power to damage, certainly. And narrative has played a damaging role in Canadian and First Nations relations, understanding of one another's stories, even conversation, right? I firmly maintain that narratives and narrative tropes have power. They have the power to do incredible and long-lasting damage. But that isn't the only role that narratives can or should play. Narratives and the language that constructs them also have incredible power to fight against stereotypes, to address unjust histories and relationships. And so the last term I want to offer you tonight is the concept of unlearning. Unlearning means to acknowledge that something that you thought was true is actually untrue, such as false or partial histories, damaging narrative representations that become dominant discourses and stereotypes. So you have to acknowledge them first, and then you have to actively work to address, acknowledge, and change your understanding of the facts. And settler colonial ancestry people like me, I'm talking to you, right? Because First Nations people know their stories, or are learning them, or are doing the work to learn them. I am part of a population that has been told I have always had a right to be here, and that is simply untrue, right? So we have to acknowledge wow. Unlearning would also require, right, that we non-Aboriginal allies learn to be allies by educating ourselves, not just about settler colonial histories, but also about how we read mainstream narratives. Like, for example, doing the work to find out how financial relationships between the government and First Nations actually work, rather than saying, hey, is that new budget, the audit of Attawapiskat, isn't that damning, right? It would actually mean that we have to unlearn knee-jerk reactions, such as asking where all the government money goes. Unlearning means undertaking hard critical work. It might mean thinking about the timing of the Deloitte Touche audit, It might require understanding that that audit began 5 years before Teresa Spence became chief. Unlearning means that those of us with settler colonial histories need to work very hard indeed to recognize our own complicities in this narrative of nation. So finally, to Idle No More and my relationship to it. In my view, Idle No More is an incredible model for facilitating unlearning, for working together to acknowledge the past, the present, and to work together for an equitable future for all of us living here on Turtle Island. Idle No More is a grassroots movement that invites models of productive unlearning of these damaging narratives. And the Idle No More movement also makes space for and asks that allies acknowledge the power of narrative both to marginalize and divide people and to move forward. In order to move forward into a collaborative relationship built on mutual respect, we need to learn each other's stories and unlearn the dominant discourses of them. We need to value each other's narratives and narrative strategies. And in doing this work, at least on the part of a fourth-generation settler colonial like myself, this requires acknowledging that not only do I have much to learn, I have a hell of a lot to unlearn too. Thanks.
They have the guns, all we are is flesh and blood, but we will multiply our numbers and drown them in our flood. Yes, we will. Yes, we will. They say they will incorporate the world. Oh, my.